All right, guys, welcome. We're live for episode number 47 of the Before the Trainwreck series. I'm joined again by my good friend, Dr. Sean T. Smith.
Rich, how
And
you doing?
doing good. And we got a guest today, Scott, who is a doctor, psychologist, clinical psychologist.
Right, same as John, same level.
Yeah, but specialized in military work. So you've noticed a trend. And I know that you and Sean kind of went through a bit of a dry run and did some background, but you've noticed a trend of a lot of guys that struggle, that are world-class warriors, right? Like they can go and get the bad guys and do their job and come home alive, but they somehow end up having a really hard and bad time with women. It's funny because it was about a year ago around this time I was down in the middle of Florida, and there's a ex-Navy SEAL that runs this training facility. And we got to send some lead down range with some sniper rifles and do a bunch of other drills. And his friend pulled me aside. He didn't even actually mention it to me directly, but his friend pulled me aside. He's like, look, this guy's awesome. He's world class, but he's having some serious problems with his chick, sort of thing. So that was the first that I ever heard of it. I mean, I always just assumed that strong, competent, alpha, virtuous men would be that way with women too. I posted the topic in my community, and I'm just going to put this comment up here so you guys can see it. But he says, too bad women usually respond to money, muscles, and game instead of courage, strength, and decency. That kind of sums up the struggle that they usually arrive back to. So I want to throw you on the soapbox. Tell everybody who you are and what brought you to what you're doing right now.
Right, so I'm Scott Klajic, or Dr. Klajic. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm a retired Army major. I did my first 7 years in the Army as an enlisted soldier from the late 90s until about 2004 when I got out. I went back to graduate school, got my PhD in clinical psychology, and came back in as a captain. I retired roughly 10 years later, which was in 2018. And now I do a lot of forensic work and a lot of evaluations for veterans who are claiming PTSD and stuff like that for their disability claims and stuff like that. And
so what does forensic work mean in your field?
So I have a contract with the Office of the Public Defender here in the state of Montana when they have a client where there is an issue of well, it would be kind of like sanity, but it's different in Montana. It's called guilty but mentally ill. They will send that person to me, or if there's also another issue called fitness to proceed. So this is sort of before the trial. If they've been arrested, they're sitting in the jail, and somebody looks at them and says, they don't look quite right. We need to see if they can understand the process before they can even go to the next step. I go into the jail and I interview them and render an opinion about that, and then the court decides if they're going to either go through their trial or they're going to go to the state hospital instead, right? So there's a number of pieces to that, but that's basically what forensics looks like for me. So I don't do a lot of therapy. I'm not a big therapist like Sean. I think Sean is more of a treatment guy, but it's just not my thing. So.
Is there a reason why you don't focus on treatment?
I'm not very good at it.
Okay.
I don't really have the demeanor for that, and you may find if like the last month or so I've basically taken a crash course in Rich Cooper. I've been watching massive amount of videos from you because I wanted to make sure
I was through all that.
No, I've been involved in the red pill for like a decade, and I was sort of marginally aware of this Rich Cooper guy, and I was like, I got to start listening to his stuff. I got to figure out what he's about. What you'll find if you go back and read any of my stuff or see anything that I've ever written is I'm a pretty big nature guy. And so that puts me at a disadvantage when I look at people who are trying to change a whole lot about themselves, because I don't find it to be very useful in most cases. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And so most of the time, people will do what they've always done unless there is a huge incentive to make some major like core level change to themselves. And so I come across as a little bit fatalistic. I do have some therapy patients, but they have to be a particular mindset. They have to be somebody who's really, really motivated to look at themselves and look at what they can change about them. Because they can't change the world, they can't change the people around them. There's nothing they can do about the situation, but they can change them. Their outlook, whatever. And so that's a small slice of what I do. But
what's the biggest struggle that you see with guys returning home from deployment with women?
Right. So in order to really sort of hop onto this topic, one of the things that we have to talk about is the military suicide rate. So if you'll give me just a minute, we need to have a little bit of a sort of a history lesson on that, right? So we have to go back to.
I'm going to give you front row seating. There you go.
Okay, great. So we go back to roughly 2003 timeframe, and if the first pop quiz question is what was going on in 2003. Anybody want to take a shot at it?
Desert Storm, wasn't it?
Well, 2003 we were engaged in two different fronts. By the middle of 2003 we were engaged in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Right.
And that was the first time since we've been tracking this data that we actually saw the military per 100,000 rate between the civilian population and the military flip. And the military started to outpace the general population on suicide rate for the first time that we'd ever seen it. And the conventional wisdom was, well, it must be the op tempo, right? It must be the deployments. We're going back to back, balls to the wall, op tempo, deployment. People were doing deployments, coming back for a month and going right back out. And so we sort of ignored the problem for a little bit because we assumed that it was as soon as the op tempo slows down or the war is over, or whatever, this will sort of revert back to its baseline and everything will be fine. But some people started asking questions about that, and they actually started doing some studies on them. They're called the MHAT studies, MHAT studies, where they were sending research psychologists into theater to sort of look at some of this stuff. And what we found was that the deployments were actually a spurious variable. They were a coincidence, right? So it was pretty confounding to a lot of people because what we did in response to the suicide rate was we started trying to equalize the op tempo for everybody so that there would be an amount of dwell time. You'd come back from deployment, you'd have some time to stabilize with your family before you would go again. And it had zero impact on the suicide rate, and it continued to climb.
Scott, let me jump in and make sure I understand. So the assumption was that there's a correlation between suicide and deployment. And the assumption was that deployment was causing suicide or connected to suicide.
Something like that, right?
Okay.
And they turned out to be wrong about that. And there was a lag time for a couple of years because we assumed that for a while before anybody really started looking at it and saying, hey, is this really true? So that caused them to have to start looking at actual variables that might be causing, these suicides, or might be increasing the rate or whatever. And, we have to talk like scientists, right? Like we don't really know what causes a suicide, but we can take a look at risk factors, and there's all different kinds of ways you can sort of slice through a phenomenon, right? So it gets into the weeds of the science of how they did that, but basically they said, whoops, it's not the deployments, it's something else, right? So then we started looking at a lot of things, and the long story short of that, let's get to all the end of all the literature and everything else that was going on in the civilian world at the same time. What we find is that the mode suicide, the most commonly occurring suicide in the military, is a male who has had what we would call a within 90-day disruption in a significant relationship, which is a fancy way of saying my girlfriend broke up with me or my wife is leaving me, right? So something around about 90 days of that happening is where the suicide happens. My own personal clinical experience with that conceptually is that on the deployments that I've been on, I have managed suicide risk for guys like that almost exclusively. So, and this is even a worst case scenario, right? Where you're sitting there in Afghanistan and you get what we call a Dear John letter in the form of an email or whatever. And that letter basically says, now here's the part where I promised Sean I was going to try to keep my language squared away because I know you have risk getting kicked off of YouTube or whatever, but I'm an Army retiree, so pardon me if I slip a little bit. Great. So the letter will say something like, hey, I'm out here in Fort Hood, Texas. I've got a new boyfriend. I'm shacking up with him. I'm living in your apartment. I'm going to stay here until the end of your deployment. And when you get back, you're going to find your apartment empty, your bank account's drained. And, thanks for shacking me up with my new boyfriend and all that stuff. Brutal stuff like that. And what happens in a case like that, because of the way the Army is built and regulated around this sort of like hard blue pill concepts is the commander will say to the soldier in that situation, you better make sure that you do not change any bank account numbers. You do not take any money away from her. She's entitled to her, what they call BAH and BAS, which is basic allowance for housing, basic allowance for substance. You are not allowed to engage in anything that is going to disrupt your wife's life back home. And a nice commander might say something like, hey, buddy, sorry, it's kind of a bummer, but this is what the regs are telling me I have to do. I've got to take care of the wife. I've got to make sure that she is not having any kind of a disruption in her life, even though she has basically just dropped a bomb on you. And you need to stay engaged in the fight. You need to stay in, because you're not going home. You got to stay here and do what you're required to do. Right. So that is the mode suicide. That who usually kills themselves is that guy. Now,
how do they usually do it? Is it while they're on deployment? Like, do they hang themselves?
Yeah. So
they just use a rifle and put it in their mouth, or
right. So when you talk about suicide as a factored like risk phenomenon, Sean knows this. You're looking at young males with access to firearms, and there's nothing but automatic weapons laying around. Your risk algorithm is pegged. As soon as you show up in theater, you're basically trying to be a psychologist, and you're like, man, there's nothing but suicide risk around here, right? And so you have to really sort of calibrate how you're gonna deal with risk. And one of the things they suggest you do as the doctor in that situation is take the firing pin out of the weapon, put another soldier on them, sort of keep an eye on them for a week and see how they're doing. But that creates a whole nother set of issues, right? So let's say I'm a soldier sitting in my chew and I have no firing pin in my weapon, and all of a sudden we get attacked, right? And now I got to pick up my weapon and go engage, and click, I got no weapon, right? So there's a whole, it's all fucked up. I mean, it's really, really a mess when you're trying to
this question.
manage this kind of risk over there. So
that letter that arrives to these guys, like, is it common that it's that harsh that I'm cleaning out the accounts and
I'd say
Jody while you're away?
I'd say it's about half the time it's that harsh, and then there's sort of varying degrees of, hey, it's not working out. I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore. But regardless, the factor that's being impacted there is what Dr. Thomas Joyner calls thwarted belongingness, right? So Joyner has this sort of 3-factor model of suicide. One factor is thwarted belongingness. The other one is called perceived burdensomeness. And the other one is the acquired ability to commit suicide. That thwarted belongingness is, now I am no longer a part of this 2-person unit, this marriage. When you lose that feeling of belongingness, your suicide risk pops up really, really fast. So there's
a comment there on the YouTube chat from this guy Dave, and he says coming back was way harder from Yugoslavia than actually being there. Guys would see horrible things at war for their family and then have no family when they'd come back.
Mm-hmm. I lost
so it's not that uncommon.
I lost one like that. So I had a guy in Afghanistan on my first tour who got that really, really brutal letter. And he somehow managed to sort of put it together with her over the phone, over email, and all this stuff. And they kind of worked it out. And she was like, okay, well, let's try to stay together and all this. And so he actually re-enlisted for another duty station. So, Rich, I'm not sure if you know how this works, but in the Army, they will dangle stuff in front of you like, hey, here's a $20,000 bonus. You can do duty station of your choice, whatever, if you sign up for 4 more years, right? So his wife said, I want to go to Fort Lewis. I want to get a fresh start. We don't know anybody there. It'll be all fresh faces and all this stuff. So he signs on the dotted line and says, yeah, let's go to Fort Lewis and get a whole new start with our family. When he gets back to Fort Hood, she changes her mind and he blows his brains out, dead. Right. So, and there was no way I could stop that. I mean, he was my patient. I had him in the hospital 3 or 4 times sort of leading up to that because he was getting worse and worse and worse. And, but it's a free country. You can do whatever you want when you're out of the psych ward. So.
Just real quick, guys, just want to pause just to clarify how this works. I know some people will watch this and be like, why wasn't I notified? I wanted to watch it live. Like, you need to hit the notification bell to watch stuff live. Second thing is the way that the comments work up on the screen. Paul, I see your comment. I follow the YouTube comments for the screen usage. So if you're watching this on other platforms, head over to YouTube, watch it there, please. Paul, I can see your comments. If you can't switch over because of your deployment, I can definitely put yours up. So if there's something you want to add to the conversation, just drop it there on Facebook and I'll make sure that Scott can see it. Sorry, carry on.
Well, that was kind of the end of that thought.
Okay.
I was thinking. Go ahead.
It's just okay. I'm not surprised, right? I mean, you go away. Like, what's the deployment length for? Is it 6 months or?
Well,
Usually?
it's been pretty varied, right? So in 2011, which was my first deployment to Afghanistan, they were down to a year.
Okay.
After that, they moved them down to 9 months, and there are some logistical reasons why they changed them like that, and it's kind of BS. But the reg says that if you're in theater for a year, you are required to receive a 2-week R&R in the middle, right? So you can actually go home for 2 weeks and spend 2 weeks with your family, then go back to your deployment. They cut it short of a year. They're not required to give you that 2 weeks. So you just have to do the whole 9 months nonstop.
Yeah.
And there's sort of pros and cons to that. I mean, I did my 2 weeks at home, and coming back to Afghanistan the second time with the kids dragging, hanging on my knee and stuff I almost wish I would have just gone straight through. It was it's pretty rough doing the goodbye
what do the stats
twice.
say as far as guys' experiences with their significant others when they return, whether it's wives, fiance, girlfriends? They're in a committed relationship. They go do their deployment. What do the stats, reveal about that significant other still being there when they return?
Boy, I don't really know. I don't know. I'm sure that data exists. I don't know what you're basically talking about the divorce rate or the still together rate after a deployment. I'm not really sure. I've never seen that. I'm sure it exists. I just don't know.
So why do guys suck with women? These world-class warriors that come back, is it just like the same blue pill conditioning that a lot of guys suffer from?
Well, so I have some thoughts about that. I think there's a couple of different variables that are in play here. So think about a military base, an active duty military base like Fort Hood, which is where I retired out of, where you have something like 84,000 active duty soldiers all in one place, right? And most of them are young enlisted guys. And start thinking about the incentives that exist that are sort of built into the military system to marry a soldier. Okay, if you marry a soldier, you get free healthcare. If, let's say, you have 5 kids in tow from 5 different men, all 5 of your kids, free healthcare. All of them are going to automatically be enrolled in the military medical system. It's called it's called DEERS, and then DEERS gets you into TRICARE. You get commissary privileges, PX privileges, on-post gyms, all this other stuff you get for being married to a soldier. As soon as you have that marriage certificate, you are entitled to all of these things as a dependent, right? So, and this is just a hypothesis of mine, but I mean,
do those benefits continue even after they break up?
Well, remember what I said. Army recognizes married, not married. So if you are separated, she's doing all kinds of whatever, but you're still married to her.
Still married, technically, yeah.
She will continue to have her ID card and all that stuff, right? So just think for a moment about what a place like that would attract, right? To be around military bases and stuff like that. So you're looking, a little bit of this is what's available, right? So this is what you're going to find as soon as you drive outside the post of an army base. And you guys are old enough to remember the movie Officer and a Gentleman, right? This was talked about in the 1983 movie, right? Remember the premise of this whole movie was these 2 girls are hanging out waiting for these guys who are going through OCS and flight school and all this stuff, right? And the one girl fakes a pregnancy and her boyfriend basically says, oh, well, I'm going to quit the Navy and I'm going to go back to Walmart and be a manager there and we'll be married and all this stuff. And she leaves him and she says to him, I wanted to be the wife of a naval aviator. I didn't want to be the wife of a guy at Walmart. And he kills himself. So this is not something new. This isn't something that just popped up in the last. People have known about this since they were making movies in the 1980s, and it's just more of the same, right? So does that make sense? I mean, that's kind of that's part of what I think is going on.
Do they believe comforting lies more than the average guy does?
I think that
or is it like the distance, like, their distance, they get a couple of Skype calls or they get a few emails.
Maybe I think that the type of guy, and this is not meant to be a disparaging comment because this was who I was when I joined the Army, but I think the type of guy who joins the Army is probably most likely to be a trad con from middle America. You know, I'm going to join the army to fight the terrorists, and I'm going to be chivalrous,
do the right thing.
You know, like that kind of guy, right? Like that's basically what that's about. And the army, well, the military, I say the army a lot because that's what I was in, but we're really talking about a sort of a broader, you know, multi-force problem. The army has been trying really, really hard to like bring women into combat roles and to doing all these other things while maintaining that, you know, the blogger Dalrock used to call this, you know, weak men screwing feminism up. Like that's basically like you just have to keep your options as a man in that environment just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But you still have to be the do the right thing guy. You have to be the blue pill guy. You have to, you know, do, you know, TradCon beliefs and all that stuff. And it just they just get squeezed out.
So,
you know,
these are interesting personality dynamics because you're talking about the TradCon who's trying to do the right thing. And earlier you talked about the very harsh, you know, gut-wrenching, cruel Dear John letter, and you said that about half the Dear John letters are pretty cruel.
Yeah,
and it leads me to think that the women writing these Dear John letters are not perhaps the highest quality women. So I'm wondering, you know, you got these TradCon guys who are very duty-driven, and they're connecting potentially with women who are not really ideal for them.
Yeah. So here's some more anecdotal data, right? So I met my wife in graduate school, and we were not at a military. It wasn't a military town. It was in the Bay Area, right? So my current wife had no sense of all this. She wasn't tracking, you know, hook up with a soldier and get all these benefits. The only thing she knew about the Army was what I told her. You know, I basically said, this is what's happening. I am going to be an intern at wherever the Army sends me in 3 years. So if you want to hitch onto that, this is what I'm about. And she did. We got married, and that was cool. And then she started reading books about, you know, military wife life, you know, and she was reading books about that were written by older military wives from a different generation about having coffees together and then going to these military balls and dressing all up. And the first military ball that me and my wife went to, all the women there. So my wife wears this like super, super conservative gown that goes all the way down to her ankles, you know, just like she thinks that we're going to an 18th century, you know, Christmas ball, basically, because she was told that that's what it was going to be like. And there's nothing there but skin, tattoos, boobs hanging out, twerking at the dance floor and stuff. And my wife was like, I'm not doing this. This is not what I thought we were. She thought we were stepping back in time. By joining the military, we're going to have this super old-fashioned conservative life, and she was really disappointed by that. So I don't think you're too far off with the sort of quality piece, right? Like I can't quite put my finger on that, or if I do, I'll sound mean. I'm just,
no, we can sound well. Let's just call it like it is. Like, I want to be truthful here. Who cares if it sounds mean or not, and somebody's feelings get hurt? I'm not too worried about that. There was something in the email, and I can't find it right now, Sean, but I think that you said something about tattoos or like the quality of these women being quite low. There's some association. Do you want to talk about that, Scott?
Yeah, because you and I, Scott, had a conversation about what's available to a guy just walking out of basic training on these bases.
Right. And that's basically what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily basic training. It would technically be your first duty station. Right. So you get out of basic training and you get orders to wherever. Fort Hood, Fort Bragg. The most common places are Hood, Bragg, Fort Lewis. And that's just the Army. There's the Air Force, there's the Navy. But those are the big three posts. Fort Carson, Colorado is another big one. Tens of thousands of soldiers. I think, like I said, this stuff hasn't been thrown against the wall to stick yet. You know, nobody studies this stuff, right? These are questions that nobody wants to talk about, nobody wants to ask. When the suicide rate really started to rocket out in like 12, 13, 14, at that point, I was a kind of a mid-grade, sort of becoming a senior officer, and I was an instructor at Fort Sam Houston, right? So I had done my tours, and once you do a couple of tours and you get promoted, they start saying to you, hey, now you can do what you want to do, right? So I went to be an instructor at Fort Sam Houston, and they started barking up this tree again. And they do this every couple of years, and they're like, hey, what is the deal with the suicide rate? Let's go talk to some senior Army psychologists. And I was one of them. I was on one of these task force, and I was like, you know what you got to do? You got a problem with like these military wives who are divorcing their husbands while they're downrange and they're blowing their brains out because they're going through these ugly, and they would just be like, yeah, we're not tracking that, because they're not going to go after that side. It's not a piece of data that they want to engage with or anything like that. So
what's their motivation for avoiding that data?
Because women are a protected class in our society. I mean, you can't complain about them. You can't say, hey, they're driving this. You can't even entertain that.
So even just noticing that there's a correlation.
Oh yeah, noticing is a crime.
Dear John letters and suicide.
Right.
That's
what I think. It was just weird.
Okay.
When these guys get out of basic training, like I'm guessing this is where they're forming their relationships with these women.
Wait, sorry, say that again.
When these guys get out of training before they're deployed, like I'm guessing this is where the relationships start to form.
Yeah,
this guy's got camo. He has a gun. He looks like a badass.
Right. So this is a confound, right? So this part, I'm not sure how this would play out in the data if you were actually to look at it. There are a lot of guys who go to basic training with already having a girlfriend from high school, right? So that basically they're like, hey, I'm going to hook up. This guy seems like he's going places. He's going to join the military. He's going to do great things and all stuff. And then while they're in basic and AIT, that's when they get the, I didn't mean it. I'm not going to follow you to the Army or whatever. And then there's another group of them that meet somebody in basic training or AIT, because we do have a lot of co-ed basics and AITs. I went to an all-male basic in AIT, but there are a few that have men and women together. So maybe another soldier that they meet, and they get together, and then they spend their first month's paycheck on a $3,000 engagement ring, and then they get orders to go to two different places, right? So one of them goes to Fort Lewis, one of them goes to Carson, and then you get the same thing. The Dear John. These are all of them are poorly formed relationships from the very start.
That unfold very quickly, I assume.
Right. So that's a bummer, right? I mean, I don't know what to do about that, but that's just the way it is.
So
is there any discussion?
Hypergamy doesn't care if you're a warrior saving the world in Afghanistan.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
Any discussion, like do the older guys, the officers, ever talk to the younger guys about what to look out for, and younger women too? I mean, it's they're young people, right, going into the world. And does anybody talk to them about how to not screw things up with your personal life? So imagine a male officer standing in front of a company of soldiers where 85% of them are men and 15% of them are women, and trying to say, all right, you guys, we're going to talk about marriage, and all, because that's how they put information out in the military, right? If on the rare occasion that an officer like that would actually have the balls to say that, he would also then have to do the whole caveat and disclaimer of and you girls too, you got to watch out for these guys that are going to do, they have to basically crap on everything they just said, to make it equality or whatever, to basically say, oh yeah, by the way, this also happens to women, and maybe it does every once in a bazillion years, but I mean, it's the military is still 85% male. No matter how much engineering they try to do, that's who joins the Army, is men, right? So that's part of that, right? So now think about this. Is another little sort of interesting. When I did my dissertation, it was on a related topic, and I had to do a lot of studying on what this sort of looked like before, 100 years ago, right? And did you know that right up until about the Civil War, soldiers used to have to get permission to get married? Mm-hmm. So basically, they did get permission from their commander, and basically they almost never got it, because the whole idea was that life in a combat unit was really not compatible with marriage and having a family and all this stuff. And then over the next 100 years, we built in all of these processes and all of these, like I said, these benefits to being married to a soldier and all this stuff. And we have this gigantic military infrastructure that's sort of built around this idea that, families and military are compatible and all this stuff. And so now we've got, and I think to myself, it would be cool if we went back to this getting commanders permission to get married,
where the commander would actually sit down with the couple and look at them and go, nope, this is not going to work out because this is just somebody who's trying to glom on to, to like military benefits and all stuff. Never happened. But that was the kind of stuff that I was saying when they were asking me, what do you think about the suicide rate? I'd be like, make it really hard to marry a soldier. Make it really hard to marry a soldier. Make it so that we're pretty sure this is a good relationship and this is going to work out. And they were like, nope, marriage is a right. People can just marry whoever they want. I'm like, all right, fine.
There's a lot of strange coping things I've heard the military do. I mean, I've never served per se. I mean, I wanted to when I was a kid fly RAF jump jets because I was born in England, so I would have qualified, but I was too tall for the cockpit, so that kind of blew that idea out of the water and went to Plan B. But I read somewhere else that during World War II in the Pacific, there was so many pilots that were getting shot down. Of course, all male pilots. That's where the one of the first known cases publicly of polygyny started to happen because the families would just kind of blend, and if there was like 5 guys in the group and 4 of them got shot down, somehow there was one pilot left that was there to take care of a bunch of other families, so he was just banging everybody.
Nice.
But there's some strange coping stories that I've heard around military. Here, there's a question here. Rolo's in the chat. He said, ask Scott what happens to wives of the soldiers who kill themselves before the divorce is final.
It's like I said, married, not married. So it's the same, she's going to get all the life insurance money, all that stuff. Like the Army does not recognize separated. Your wife's a dirtbag. There's none of it's just married, not married. That's it. And that
do these women get counseling on these facts before they send these Dear John letters?
Oh,
like, is this information public or
it's probably just common,
just common knowledge, like you go girl, like this is what you can do. You're covered.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no consequences then. So, I mean, you can't be particularly surprised if that's what the soldier's getting when he opens up his mail.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, it's really heartbreaking to see that, because like I had at one point, I had suggested to my superiors when I was a very young psychologist, I was like, hey, what you could do is you could actually put in some, by regulation, you wouldn't even have to pass any laws or anything like that. You could put in some regulations to make, for example, it should be illegal to divorce a soldier while he's in theater. I think that they could easily do that and say, you just, whatever your problem is, you've got to wait till he gets back, because you're when you do I don't know how they do it in Canada, but in America, when you divorce somebody, you sue them. You're basically involved in a lawsuit with the other person. You're claiming, that they've breached the contract, or it's that kind of language that happens. And so they should just say, can't sue a soldier while he's engaged. And then just wait till they come back. But
how much does the typical grunt get paid? To go and shoot bad guys?
We could probably look it up, but by the time you get out of basic training, you're usually an E3, because the first 4 ranks come automatically. E1, 2, 3, and 4. They just come by time and grade, and it's probably $2,200 a month, something like that. Because you live in the barracks, you don't have to pay for food or housing.
So there's no food and accommodation, but even back home, your wife, girlfriend, fiance is covered as well by the military.
Well, yeah. So if you're married, then you get BAH and BAS based on zip code. So your income jumps up a bit because that's supposed to pay for rent and food. Because now you don't live in the barracks, right? So as soon as you, and this is another confound. This is an incentive on the soldier side. Soldiers don't really like living in the barracks. So they're like, hey, if I just get married to any old chick, I can actually move into an apartment off post and have a dog and guns and all the stuff that I want to have when I'm living off post. And so you got to give a little blame to the guys in that case, because they're basically just saying, I'll just find whoever so I can get an apartment and all that stuff. And then they're not tracking what enormous amount of risk they're putting themselves into just so that they can live off post, because living on post in the barracks sucks. It really is so lame. So
these young men are really clearing 25, 26 grand a year with obviously no living expenses, but that's it's fucking peanuts. And they're dodging bullets and they're being treated like crap if their girlfriend decides that she wants to go bang somebody else and send a Dear John letter, and she can clean out the bank account. So you can't do anything about it.
Right. No, you can't. I've had
for the military now, fellas.
Yeah. I would
I
not
have a question for
recommend
you.
that any
If
of
a
my
young man
boys
says to you, Scott,
join the
hey, should I
military.
sign up for the military? What kind of advice would you give him?
Oh, we kind of cross-answered that. I'm not recommending it to my sons.
Yeah.
I'm not really a fan. I just don't see the like I said, when I joined, it was before September 11th, and then I re-enlisted after September 11th, because I wanted to go fight the terrorists and kill the bad guys and all that stuff. And my 20 years in the military, not just this stuff, not just the way men but I'm pretty ambivalent about my service. I'm proud of it, but I've got some issues. So,
I got a question for you, Scott. Let's say a young guy, graduates basic. He ships off to Fort Carson, Colorado, or wherever, and he's single when he gets there. Where's he going to meet women? And what kind of women are they going to be?
Bars and strip clubs and all. So you live in Denver or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you don't live up there in what's the town for? What's the one there, Fort Carson? It's anyway, whatever. Whether it's Killeen, Texas, or Columbus, Georgia, or Fayetteville, North Carolina, all military towns are basically strip joints, pawn shops, barber shops, dance nightclubs. I mean, it's when I was at Fort Hood, I lived 30 miles out of town in a little tiny bedroom community called Kempner because I could afford it. I was an Army officer, but I'm not going to live in Killeen, Texas. It's gross. I mean, it's like it's all military towns are like that. It's ridiculous. So that's what you're talking about.
There's a question for you up on the screen. Do you think you can give us an answer to that one?
Oh, I bet you there is. I've never seen it, but I wouldn't be surprised if that exists. How to get the most out of your soldier while you're divorcing. Yeah, of course. It would be inconceivable that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
With all the other things that are out there on the internet.
I got Dave in the waiting area. He's got a question. Do you guys want to pull him in, or did you clear that thought, Sean?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, Dave.
Well, am I?
You're on. Your audio's good.
Okay, good. Yeah. Having served from 2000 or 1980 to 2000, I missed this latest iteration, which is fine, but I did Desert Storm 1. And it seems like from Vietnam all the way through Desert Storm 1 and all throughout the other events that happened during that time, the psychological teams that we're seeing now didn't exist. So I've got a college buddy who's been diagnosed recently with severe PTSD, but yet he has 2 kids. He's been married since the 60s, and he's now retired. No issues with that. So I think there's some social pieces that went along with the wives that prevented this bad behavior. But I've also seen other pieces of that. Since I was a commander for about 18 months, my wife found out that some of these kids that had wives and got into the Army when they were married were treating their wives terrible. Like with they would go out in the field and they'd take their ID cards back so they couldn't go to the commissary or get medical treatment. So there's a lot of training that had to be done to get the right services with the right people, and there was a lot of changes. But I think a lot of the current issues are closely related to current societal issues, where Rollo had to deal with a family member that got basically zeroed out in society, and he blew his brains out. So there's still
anybody that gets that nasty Dear John letter in the way that Scott described it, like that's zeroed out right there. That's pretty much the definition of it, right?
Absolutely agree. I mean,
yeah, and look, I've heard those stories too about soldiers doing that, and I actually met one. It's usually for a long time it sounded like bullshit to me, but my wife and I hired a girl to be our live-in nanny when I was at my first duty station at Fort Hood. And her husband were like straight out of, Deliverance hillbillies, right? I mean, it was like crazy. She had no idea that she was entitled to all this stuff. And I found out about it because I was like, hey, she wanted to go back to wherever they were from. And she said, yeah, I got to go back to home and get my nervous pills. And I was like, your nervous pills? I was like, they have doctors here in Texas that you can go to get your, whatever your psych meds are. And then I unraveled the sweater by pulling on the thread. I was like, and her husband did not sign her up for DEERS, did not tell her that she was entitled. And so I squared him away. I was like, hey buddy, you cannot, like, you will get in so much trouble if you don't like get her all signed up for this stuff. So it does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't. It was just, I think it's the rarity that occurs, because usually the Army is giving you the earful of, you better get her taken care of. You better make sure she's got her BAH. You better not ever, they're pretty harsh about that stuff. So I was surprised when that happened. I was like, wow. This is like a crazy story, but
there's a whole litany of stuff that goes on. But
did you see much suicide when you were serving, Dave?
I didn't see anything related directly to my experience and command. So
what about like the Dear John letters, with her banging Jody back home?
Well, there was normal cheating type stuff that goes on, even when you're back home and you're not in the field. But the real challenge is when you are doing training, you're intensively tied up with field problems and training exercises. And then if you go to the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, you're gone for a month. And making sure that your family support pieces are in place as a commander is a combat multiplier, because if the wives are taken care of, the soldiers are really less nervous, and they know that the Army's looking out for them. But, the wives groups are kind of a support piece, but, if she's going to cheat, she's going to cheat. There's nothing you can do about that.
Mm-hmm. You can't do anything with any scenario. It doesn't matter if you're deployed or not. I mean, she's going to do what she's going to do, right?
Yeah, it's the whole environment is pretty, and this is the part that's going to make me sound like I have some kind of lowbrow opinion of my fellow brothers in arms, but I've got to tell the truth about this. But every deployment I've ever been on, the first couple of weeks of the deployment is everybody sort of like hooking up with what's going to be their fuck buddy. Okay, the first couple of weeks is everybody sort of like feeling that out and figuring it out. And I've been on deployments that had girls hitting me over the head with it. I'm available for this, and I had to, my wife. All my wife can do is trust that I didn't. Because it is just rampant. I mean, it's just crazy. All married people, officers, junior enlisted, everybody. And so, I don't know what to do about that. That's a way bigger problem than what we can really address here. And I don't.
So these are mostly women off base, but are you also talking about
other soldiers, like junior enlisted soldiers? I was an officer,
contractors,
right?
so, engineers, suppliers,
right,
all that stuff.
Yeah. Everybody's there in the same fishbowl together, and so
right,
we were in combat arms, so we didn't have that issue. But when you're at higher levels of headquarters, like brigades, you get more women intermixed with the men. Like one of our commo officers at the brigade level had a driver who was a female specialist, and he was banging her. He got caught, and there he blew up his marriage, and then he blew up some other kids' prospects in the Army. That wasn't good.
Yeah, and then here's another little piece of anecdotal stuff that really is creepy. When on my first deployment in Afghanistan, you have to understand I was a medical guy, right? So I deployed as an individual to Afghanistan, and I met my unit there, right? So I was still an asset of Carl R. Darnall Army Medical Center at Fort Hood, Texas, and I was attached to 566, area support medical company. So that means that all of my unit, all of my bosses, everybody is still back at home, and I'm just a onesie twosie out there in Afghanistan. My wife was a civilian nurse at the clinic on post, and the deputy commander of my unit, full bird colonel, was going to her clinic, hitting on her, asking to see her. So this is my boss, my boss's boss, my senior raider, basically pulling a, hey, Captain Klajic's down range. I'll just go see if I can sniff around, his nurse wife. And, like I hear these stories from her, and she's like, what am I supposed to do? Colonel so-and-so was this and that. And I'm like, I guess you got to make a sexual harassment complaint. And she did. And then he disappeared, right? So these are the variables.
As he should.
I mean, it's like you got a soldier down range and you're going to sniff around his wife. I mean, it's like, it's just the whole thing is like that. It's just so weird. Like I don't, like I said, I don't know what to do about that. That's not that's a quality of people issue.
Yeah. It's a whole different army from what I left. I mean, just from 2000, before all this crazy stuff hit, I mean, it was bad enough. I mean, you had more stress generated by the officers and folks in your own units without having to deal with women. So there was, there was kind of a camaraderie, and there was a bonding in combat arms units that, it's a shared misery kind of thing. And everyone sort of sucks eggs the same way.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I got a quick comment I'm going to throw up on the screen here. Dave, I'm going to let you go because I got somebody else waiting to hop in. Thanks for contributing, brother.
Not a problem.
Thanks. Paul here is up on deployment. He's making this observation. I'm not going to read it just because, YouTube is like that, but you guys can read it up on the screen. Got a guy waiting here. Sean, did you have anything to ask him before we go to the next guy that's got a question?
He looks like he's in shock.
No. Nothing shocks me, but I'm thinking about what's the answer to this? Like, how can you get information to young guys going into this system that, just some basic information about?
Well, look, here's another history lesson. Here's something else that we need to consider. Okay, prior to World War II and the Cold War era, our military was made up of roughly 80,000 active duty people, and a war would break out. And we would draft 1 million people, and we would fight the war, and then everybody would go home. Mm-hmm. What we have now is we have this doctrine that's been on since the 50s that we have to have a military that is large enough, active duty, full time, to fight a two-front war at any given moment, to be able to engage in 2 different wars like we did in World War II, Japan and Germany at the same time. That creates an infrastructure that is enormous. There's 1.2 million people on active duty, and those soldiers are all on these giant bases, Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines. And what do they do when there's no war? They train for war. That's what they're supposed to be doing, right? But they're basically like college kids with a paycheck and nothing to do, right? So this becomes kind of a political discussion, but I'm kind of like, why do we need 1 million people on active duty just hanging around waiting for a war to break out? It's crazy, but these are all the stuff that we're talking about today is like second and third and fourth order effects of having an enormous military industrial complex that just sits around waiting to fight wars. We never did it that way before.
So you got a bunch of young guys with a lot of testosterone, a lot of time on their hands, and just enough money to get into trouble.
Yep.
Yeah.
I got S. Thomas here waiting, and he says he's an active Marine guy, been in 21 years, counsels young Marines daily on this stuff. So you have a couple of experiences you can chime in with, man?
Well, yeah, I just, can you guys hear me fine?
Yeah, you're good. You.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was just going to if you guys had any questions, but it's funny that this, before the train wreck actually came up when it did, because part of my current job is I travel around and we analyze units on their maintenance and supply practices, and I get to sit down with the young Marines quite a bit. And I was in an armory the other day, and a lot of the married guys, I was trying to educate them on some of the red pill stuff that I've learned from watching y'all's channels. I just recently got into this myself. I'm divorced. I was married for 16 years, and luckily mine went pretty well because she's a Marine too, so she really didn't get to take me to the cleaners. We kind of just canceled each other's stuff out. So it's nice to be able to sit down and try and pass along some of the information and the principles that you guys apply with the red pill stuff to these young Marines. But
do they hear you?
Well, that's what I was about to say. Was for the most part, a lot of them, they're just kind of nodding their head, but they're they're young and they think that, hey, this is just the old guy trying to tell me how to live my life, and they don't.
Okay, boomer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I tell them, I said, if you do anything, if you listen to anything I say, I said, just get on YouTube and search red pill and just start watching videos. But there was one kid, I think out of the 8 that were in the armory, one of them wasn't married, and I applied some of the red flag techniques that I got from Rich, and I was asking him questions like, how'd he meet her? He said Tinder. I said, how long you been together? Like 5 months.
Yeah, God.
And I said, okay, well, what do you guys do when you're together? He's like, well, we just eat, and then we kind of like go back to my place and cuddle and stuff. And I was like, well, have you slept with her? And he says, no. And I was like, have you ever been to her place? And he says, no. I'm like, that chick's married, bro. You need to get rid of into her house, and she hasn't slept with you after 5 months. There's something wrong there. But the kid, you can tell a lot of these young kids, they join the military to try and get that status, to be, in the military and be a Marine, so they can actually get some respect in their lives or pick up girls. And a lot of these, like that kid in particular, was, you could tell just by talking to him that he was pretty inexperienced with ladies and kind of dorky, and joined up for that reason.
So are most guys in the military, like, they're mostly like blue pill betas with guns, and they can do more push-ups than the average guy?
Yeah, for the most part.
Because I mean, like, you see guys like Jocko Willink. I was telling Scott and Sean before we went on, I was watching the conversation he had with Joe Rogan, and it's like, this guy wanted to be a commando ever since he was a little kid. And he doesn't have any problems with women. He doesn't have any problems with life. He's led teams of fucking legends and done incredible things. Obviously a natural alpha, but the way that you guys describe a lot of these men and their belief systems and the way that they kind of go about the world is they subscribe to an old world order, or they subscribe to basically comforting lies that they've been either told through society, media, Hollywood, religion, wherever it came from. And they just go about it, right? Thinking that everything will be fine and it'll work it out. But, Sean, you've talked about things like the safe world theory. It's like a house of cards just kind of collapses one day on you. And it's like, okay, something really drastic and big has changed. What do I do with that now? I can see how this is such a problem, and how so many guys, put a sidearm in their mouth and pull the trigger. It's
and let me this is actually a good part for where I have to sort of add another one of these sort of dimensional variables that can add a little bit of flavor to this one way or the other. When we were looking at those suicide rates that started climbing up and switching with the general population in 2003, one of the things that was looked at was the actual standards in 40-501, which is the Army standard for retention and for recruitment. The Marines have their own, I'm sure, and the Air Force and everybody else. It's basically a list of, here's all the diagnoses, here's all, like, in great detail, what you can come into the Army with and what you can't, and what you have to get a waiver for and all this other stuff. We drastically lowered those standards to be able to bring on board another 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 people on active duty from 2002 to, whatever. And so we brought in a whole bunch of pathology that would not have normally been allowed in. Okay, personality pathology, all this other stuff, this sort of like dramatic flavor to their personalities and neediness and all this other stuff that we would not have normally allowed in. And then you sit on that for 2 or 3 years, and then you start deploying those guys, and they start having these fucked up marriages and all this other stuff, and then you get suicide and all these other things at the tail end of that. And so now, you're not supposed to talk like that about soldiers, because everybody's a warrior and everybody's a hero. None of that has anything to do with this. Okay, these folks came into the military because they really wanted to fight. They wanted to do the right thing and all that stuff, but they probably weren't right for the military from the start. So, we chapter a lot of those out. Chaptering out is it's like a way of putting somebody out of the military that's kind of like a no harm, no foul, like, hey, sorry, it didn't work out, right? So we say you can go home, call yourself a hero, do whatever you want, but you can't stay here. You can't be in the military because you're offering up way too much risk for us because of all this kind of stuff, but we can't catch all of it, and we have to keep bodies on the battlefield. And so like that's part of this as well. That's definitely correlated to the suicide rate. Is what we brought in is stuff that we would not have normally brought in. That part is a for sure correlation. It's definitely.
Does the military spend any time on the risk with suicide and what happens with their women back home and female nature, or is it just they just skip all that?
Oh, well, that's not, like I said, that's an off limits topic because you can't complain about military wives. You know, it's
well, it's not even complaining about it. It's really just, well, let's talk about some cold hard truths, right? And this is what happens when you're on deployment, and this is female nature. So this is something you need to understand as you go about your day. And you may get a letter like
stopped at female nature. There's no such thing. Yeah,
you just run around, man. You're disposable. Go and shoot at shit while we protect these people over here. You're not allowed to say anything bad about them.
Right.
It really just boils down to that then. Got it. Okay.
When it comes to like marital stuff, they do offer some marriage classes, and they highly recommend it for people before they get married, but they're not. It's not mandatory.
What's the quality of the classes?
It's just your basic shit. I mean, they tried to make me do it when I was a young Marine, and I got married at 24, and I was like, like all the rest of them, I'm like, you can't make me do that. It's not mandatory. And, I didn't want someone else to tell me how to live. But as far as the counseling that they get, it's mainly from senior leadership like myself. And
let me also give you a quick rundown on the special forces types, like the guy that you're talking about, right? So the common stereotype or misconception about those guys is that they are these like uber high strung, overachieving type A alpha male types.
They probably have a very low pulse.
Yeah, but actually, so I've done some evaluations on those guys. When I was an intern, I actually got a chance to go do special forces assessment and selection, where basically you're the psychologist and you're like hiding in the bushes while these teams are learning to become special forces operators at their entry level training. And then your job is to go to the commander and say, that guy probably not going to make it, not really working as a team player. These guys that make it as special forces operators are very low key, very boring. They're like standard American Family Guy. They do not get excited about anything. They're just like really, really calm because they have to be like that. These guys go in to third world countries in teams of 12 and start a war. Right, so I mean, they cannot be high strung. It can't be any of that stuff. They've got to be super calm team players and be able to get stuff done without yelling and screaming. They can't be like that. So that's just something you might want to. That's just, and most of the Army isn't special forces. Those guys are a really tiny percentage of the population. So,
do you think these guys do better in their relationships, or worse, or no different?
Well, it's a good question because, back in 2003, you may recall the thing that sort of kicked off the suicides was actually in 2002. We had 3 special forces soldiers come back from Afghanistan and do a scorched earth, killed everybody, wife, kids, themselves, all that stuff, because the wife was cheating when they got back. So those guys were all SF soldiers. So they're, like I said, they're pretty well put together until they're not, and then they just like unravel. It's really an interesting phenomenon. So,
what do you think the solution to this is, Scott? Sorry, say it again. The divorce rate's pretty high.
Oh yeah, well yeah, we got the special operations command guys here, and I know quite a few of those guys, and the divorce rates are extremely high just because like I don't see his name there, but like the gentleman was saying, the op tempo is so high, they're gone for so long, so it's an issue. But to talk about the suicide thing, we actually discussed that, an interesting topic at a professional course that I went to a couple of years ago, and they were trying to theorize why the suicide rate was so high now when the majority of the young Marines on active duty haven't seen any combat, and a lot of trying to come up with, oh, they're young and they're weak and all this other stuff, but I was the only one that kind of like brought up the idea of, I said social media, and everybody kind of looked at me like I had a third eye. And I was like, well, think about it. I was like, when we were kids and we were growing up, we went to school for 8 hours, and then we got a 16-hour break, and now it's 24/7. They get no break. So if somebody's bullying you, they're going to bully you 24 hours a day, and you get no relief from it. And then also a lot of these kids get hooked on the likes and everything, and they post stuff, and then when people don't like their stuff, it can kind of cause your brain to go haywire, when you're not getting a chemical release whenever you're used to those likes. But I mean, like, it's just, I think it's just social media has a lot to do with it. But I mean, otherwise, I mean, you can't really say it has to do with combat when statistically the vast majority of our young Marines are wearing like 2 or 3 ribbons on their chest, and a lot of them have never even deployed.
And you may have missed that. We talked about that a lot at the beginning of the show. The data really susses out that deployment is a spurious factor. It's a coincidence. Deployment, op tempo, it's not really related to the suicide rate. That's been pretty much debunked. So, but that's what everybody thinks it is. Everybody thought it was way back in 2003, 2004. They just assumed that's what it was.
Yeah,
so
if I agree with that for sure.
I got 2 questions for both of you guys. How does the military think about suicide? Like, what do they think the purpose of suicide is from the point of view of the guy who's pulling the trigger? And then, what are their thoughts on what to do about it? Like,
so I could answer that one, second one first, easier. I'll tell you, what job I would hate to be in the Army is a company commander. I think that's probably the most stressful job there is in the military, because if you walk down the hallways, either you're in a clinic in Afghanistan or in some, nondescript building at Fort Hood, you will see signs with quotes from Colin Powell that say things like, every suicide in the military is a failure of leadership and all this stuff, right? And so these company commanders ingest this message that every single time one of my soldiers kills himself, it's my fault, that I've failed him as a leader, whatever. And so they're under this like tremendous amount of stress to like try to do something about that. And the bottom line is that the commander has basically zero power in the grand scheme of things about whether. Hey, there you go. That was in 2002. I was at Fort Bragg when that happened. They just came back.
Men are very good at hiding suicidal intent. Really good at it, and it seems like just an untenable position to put commanders in.
Right. So, and I talk about this with my patients. I talk about it when I was in the Army and I had to do a lot of briefings as a subject matter expert and all this, and you get these slideshows and all this. And I tell people that, if you look at what the literature really says about suicide, this can quickly become a discussion about suicide. But basically, if you boil all of it down, everything we know from the civilian literature, from the military and everything else, the most common suicide is a person who just went through a breakup or a divorce. That's usually your sort of your precipitating factor, right? Then there's a whole bunch of risk factors.
Which is why we see clusters around young guys and middle-aged and older guys, because
And then there's a whole bunch of risk factors. Those are the static risk factors, right? The age, the gender, all that other stuff. That's interesting and it's important, and it's going to go into your sort of risk algorithm as you're trying to figure out all of that. But then when you really look at the state of the art literature, right, the retrospective studies, these are the people who tried a lethal means to kill themselves and lived to tell about it. That's pretty rare, but you can find those, right? That's the gold standard of studying suicide, because you're like, hey, this guy jumped off a bridge and swallowed a .357 Magnum. He expected to be dead, right? And he lived to tell us about that. And so we talk to those people, and then we find out that most people who commit suicide do it within about 90 days of this breakup. Those people, most of them, do it within about 8 hours of making the decision. And then another group of those do it within about 5 minutes of making the decision. And none of them have seen any kind of medical provider, not a podiatrist or a dentist or anything, in the last 12 months. So the probability that somebody who is about to kill themselves is going to walk into my office or Dr. Smith's office and tell me about it is zero. Absolutely zero. There's no way that I'm good. And then they try to put that crap on commanders who aren't even trained in this. They're not psychologists. They don't know anything about what I just talked about. They're not even tracking that stuff. So it's really the intent piece is what we're talking about. What is this person's intent when they walk out the door here? I have no freaking clue. There's no way for me to know what they're going to, because why would they tell me about it?
What is the military's understanding of why the guy pulls the trigger?
So
your audio is gone, Scott. I don't know if you muted yourself or something happened to your microphone. Nope, you're muted now. So just hit that button again, but you're unmuted. Just make sure your mic's plugged in still. You might have knocked it out or something.
Yeah, the red light is still on it.
There you go. You're good.
There you go.
So what was I saying? Oh, so the conventional wisdom has always been, it's an act of selfishness. That's the kind of stuff that they say. There's nothing new under the sun with the suicide messaging. It's either a failure of leadership or it's an act of selfishness. There's never any looking into the now there is an instrument called the Dodser. The guy down in the left corner of the Marine may have seen one of these before, especially if you're high enough ranking. The Dodser is the Department of Defense Suicide Evaluation Report. It is a psychological autopsy that every single suicide goes through, and it is robust. It is all the collateral information. It goes on for months and months and months. That stuff gives us some pretty good ideas of, the mode suicide. Again, that's where we get this data that most of them are clustered around a breakup or something like that. That's what we find. I've done a number of those Dotsers. I've been the lead on a few of them.
How detailed do they get? Do they get into detailed description about conflict with exes or children or family? And
yeah, that stuff's in the Dodser. I don't know where that data goes, but that's it's compiled.
Okay.
So,
So somebody somewhere has some very useful information.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, they don't really care about that information, it doesn't seem. All right. Mr. Thomas, thanks for hopping in. I'm going to let you go.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Contribution. Let's go back to this layout. So, Scott, what's the solution to all this? And before you answer that question, guys, just so you have a heads up, I'm going to do a little bit of a trial tonight. A lot of you guys have asked about call-ins. When you do call-ins, I'm going to do a separate show after this. So immediately after, before the train wreck, another broadcast will commence like 15 minutes afterwards. Just need a quick bio break, but all Q&A. So we'll see how that goes. If you're a community member, you're in the chat. The link's already been posted on the community tab, so you can join there. I'll get you guys, front row access, VIP, see if you can get in first. But we'll see how that goes. That'll be at 9:45 Eastern Standard Time. Scott, what is the solution to this problem right now? What do you think it is?
So if the solution means putting a dent in the suicide rate per 100,000, which is the kind of solution that I would imagine you mean, there's two things you can do to throw the military suicide rate in reverse tomorrow. One of them would be, well, first of all, my philosophy here is that I would rather be a member of a military that is much smaller and more elite, made out of more focused, more seriously patriotic individuals who really, really, really want to be there. And in that regard, you would have to tighten up those recruitment standards again, and you would have to do psychological testing at the MEP station and have a psychiatrist or a psychologist evaluate every single recruit. And you can see personality disorders coming from a mile away. As soon as you see that, you just go turn around and go back out. You're not going in the military. You get all that stuff out, right? And then you attack it from the marriage and relationship side of it. And you start saying, hey, we're going to make it really, really hard to marry a soldier. Okay, we're going to make soldiers go through all the kinds of education that you've been asking about. Talk to them about this. Spill the beans about like what is really going on here when you get married to this whatever that you met on the out in the world, who's clearly not interested in being married and having love and like that's not what this is all about. If you could get that information to the soldiers, then in 5 years, you would probably reverse it back to where the military suicide rate would be below, because you'd have a selection criteria. You'd have a people in the military would be self-selected, and people who are married would be even more self-selected, and they would be the most mentally healthy people in the world, probably. So you wouldn't see a lot of suicide. But
this is a relatively new concept for me, because whenever I hear somebody coming back from deployment, and they use like things like trauma or PTSD or, you know, shell shock. I always thought it was something to do with combat. You know, they saw some bad shit, they saw some nasty shit, maybe they saw like a friend go down bad. Is that even remotely, like, does that even show up on the radar screen, or is the suicide situation like
PTSD,
a much greater problem?
The problem with suicide is that most people conceptualize suicide as a symptom of some other disorder. And it's not really, even if you did that, it's not a symptom of PTSD. And here's another confound that really makes this complicated.
Like somebody with PTSD is not going to shoot himself. Like he's not going to commit suicide, generally speaking.
Maybe,
right?
but it's not as strong of a correlation as everybody thinks it is. This whole idea of this crazy PTSD guy out there who's going to blow his brains out, you know, because he gets triggered is actually a pretty low base rate phenomenon. But but here's another part of this that's interesting. If you take a look at the DSM criteria for major depressive disorder and PTSD, you really can't be diagnosed with PTSD without also sweeping up into the diagnosis for major depression, because the major depressive disorder criteria is embedded into the PTSD. There's a whole bunch of overlap between those two. So it's pretty hard to have PTSD and not be depressed. And so like that's a formulaic issue and a sort of a diagnostic conceptualization. I don't know if Sean agrees with me about that or not, but that's kind of what I've never seen anybody with PTSD who wasn't also meeting the criteria for major depression. So I always just give them both. And depression is a suicidal guy, right? So,
yeah, it is a predictor, and there's so much overlap between a lot of anxiety disorders and depression, and PTSD being one of those anxiety disorders.
Yep.
Is there anybody prolific that speaks to these warriors outside of what the military provides? You know how we've got like subreddits, and you've got like Dalrock's blog and Rational Mail and stuff like that. Like, is there any?
I've had my website up now for about 1.5 years. I wish they'd call me, but nobody knows about me. I guess I'm not a very good salesperson for myself. But
so, what's your website? Why don't you just give it a quick plug? If you know, for those guys
it's Treasure State Psychological Services.
It's right there on the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a place I can put the link?
Yeah, you can post it in the private chat, and I'll just put it in the public chat if you don't have access to it. So just go to the private thing, and I'll just drop it in there for you.
I mean, I'm not trying to, sell myself. I've got plenty of work to do, but I'm just saying, if you want an ex-military psychologist who can talk about some of this stuff to real soldiers, you could probably do worse than me. So,
are you interested in doing some coaching in that regard, or what?
I've got it up on my site. Nobody calls me.
They'll call you after tonight.
All right, so here's the link. I'll just drop it in public if you guys want to visit Scott's site. Also on Twitter as American Dad 1971.
It's a catchy name, right?
Yeah.
My birth year.
We got another 15 minutes left before we got to wrap up. Sean, is there anything else you wanted to cover while we're on this?
I just always go back to that risk management question of how to screen out the wrong people. And it's such a tough population because these are young guys that, I remember when I was 21, I wasn't listening to anybody and I was making bad choices. And I just wish there was some way to head this off at the pass, because your solutions sound ideal. They also sound like they're probably not going to happen in the next month or so or ever. And so how do we get some information to these guys about, just slow it down, just cool your jets with the ladies. Let's think about what we're doing and be intentional. And if she's got a giant snake tattoo on her left thigh, maybe that's an indicator, that sort of information. And yeah.
But chicks like that turn these guys on.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they turn me on a little bit too. I get it, but
that's dudes, right? I mean, they don't know any better until they experience the trauma. It's always the same thing that leads guys to this kind of content, to the red pill, to the books and the broadcasts that we talk about. It's always some form of trauma, and unfortunately, there's always going to be a certain element. There's going to be a part of that demographic that's just not going to get to the clarity, to the answers, to the uncomfortable truths that they're seeking, and instead they opt out, right? Sucks, but I mean, how do you how do you stop that? Like, how do you fix that? I mean, you put out information clarifying that, talking to guys that are out there in the field. I mean, is there anybody out there right now making videos about when Jody bangs your wife, right? Like, is there somebody answering that question? Because that's an area that you might want to hit on, Scott. I mean, if you have a YouTube channel, like I saw you put out that one video that you shared on Twitter, sharing your own personal experience as a younger man. But that's an opportunity to reach some of these guys too, right?
Yeah, I mean, and Sean, I kind of got back onto what Sean was talking about risk management and stuff like that. In the Army, you have to become an amateur suicidologist because it's basically it's a constant messaging from DOD. Suicide. That's all we do in mental health in the military is manage it, talk about it, work on the risk and all that stuff. And one of the parts of that is I think understudied is the concept of future orientation. Mm-hmm. I've found that even if you throw into your risk algorithm if you had a supercomputer and you could predict as close as possible the next imminent suicide in your panel of patients or whatever, and you've got their demographics, their age, their gender, their access to firearms, all these, their mental health record, all this other stuff. The tiebreaker looks to me like future orientation, right? So it basically wipes out all of that stuff. And my story is when I went through my divorce in 2000, I was actually out hunting quail with a bunch of my buddies, and they were in a different draw from me. And I thought about sticking my shotgun in my mouth and blowing my head off. I was at that point, and it quickly evaporated and turned into something else. The reason it did is because I kept thinking, there is a point someplace in the future where it's not going to be this bad anymore. I don't know what that's going to look like. I can't articulate it. I didn't know that I was still going to become a PhD and an Army officer and get married again and have kids and have a ranch in Montana. I had none of that stuff on my radar screen, but I just knew that there was there was something different. That if you can do that, you will live another day. If you can just remind yourself, this pain is temporary. I'm not going to be like this forever. That's the tiebreaker on, I think. I don't know. I haven't really, looked at the data, but that's what it looks like to me in my practice. Those are the people that live, the ones who have future orientation. If you're still thinking about tomorrow, you're going to be alive tomorrow to live through that, right? So,
this is a little bit of inside baseball for me and Scott, but there's a great book, one of the best books ever written on suicidal assessment is by Strosahl and Childs, and I think it's called The Clinical Prediction of Suicidal Behavior, something like that. But I'm certain of the authors. I don't remember titles very well, but they frame suicidal behavior as problem-solving behavior, meaning that you get to that point where you were at, and pulling the trigger would make everything go away. It would make all of those problems go away, and the divorce and the Dear John letter and Jody back home, and everything just stops. And to your point, if you can hang on to the fact that there might be other ways to solve this problem, and I'm not going to feel this way forever. And that seems like a couple of really important messages to get to young men. And how effective is the military at getting those messages, since they're so, they're clearly concerned about suicide, right? Yeah. So how effective are they at advancing messages like that company commanders can actually impart onto their soldiers?
Yeah. And that I used to talk about it with my patients all the time when I was on active duty. And I also, the Army did come up with a suicide prevention model called ACE. And I forget what the ACE stands for exactly. It was something like ask. Anyway, the model was for the down in the trenches soldiers. It was basically the basic premise of it was the guy right next to you is going to be a lot more in tune to what's going on with you than the psychologist who sits up in his office and sees you once a week or whenever he sees you. And so it was basically this, it was almost like making every soldier sort of a mini suicide risk assessor. And then if you got the heebie-jeebies about your buddy, you were supposed to drag him to a guy like me. You're supposed to bring him in and say, hey, I'm not sure my buddy's doing okay. And I thought that was pretty cool. There was actually some merit to that. Do
you think it was effective?
I don't know. I don't know if I got out of the Army right around the time that data was probably starting to come out. I don't really follow much of that anymore.
So if a guy does that, if he drags his buddy to see somebody like you, do either one of them essentially get punished for this interaction?
They're not supposed to. I mean, I've never
supposed to, but do they?
I don't think so. I think that the Army is so freaked out about suicide that they're actually it's an issue of sensitivity versus specificity at this point. Every single person who looks even remotely suicidal is going to get dragged in and looked at and stuff with a whole bunch of misfires, right? I mean, they're going to, you know.
By punished, I should be more precise with my language. What I mean is, does that affect their career?
Well, okay. So that issue, the issue of what they've been calling it the stigma of military mental health for as long as I've been involved in the military, right? When I first came into the Army as a psychologist, it was always, we got to get rid of the stigma of military mental health, which was basically stop stigmatizing people going in and seeing a mental health provider. Well, you have to shake that out a little bit because there's a lot of different reasons why people end up going to a provider. One of them is called a command-directed mental health evaluation. It's a highly regulated activity of Army psychology, and pretty much only Army psychologists do it. Psychiatrists don't do it. They have a lane. Social workers don't do it. They have a lane. But PhD psychologists in the Army, there's only about 300 of them on active duty, own that concept of the command-directed evaluation. That's when the commander, your weird behavior comes to the attention of the commander, and he orders you to go see a psychologist because he's concerned about your behavior. 9 times out of 10, by the time you're sitting in front of Dr. Klajic, you are probably got one foot out the door because things have gotten so weird for you that it's looking like we're probably gonna kick you out. There's a difference between that and sort of voluntarily going in and saying, hey, I've got some issues or whatever. I had a professor in graduate school who used to say it's way easier to get you out of the mud when you're in the mud up to your ankles than when you're in the mud up to your eyeballs, right? So the mud up to your ankles is, I'm having a bad day. It's sort of like the early stages of like a depressive episode where you start to feel kind of lethargic and you're not really sure what's going on. That's when you're supposed to go see the doctor. But up to the eyeballs is your drinking's increased. You've had a suicide attempt. You're going through. At that point, it's like you're toast, buddy. Like it's really hard to throw that career back together, right? And that's a bummer. Like I don't know what if that answers your question, but I mean, like in other words, the stigma of military mental health is real. It's based on, you're going to see Dr. Klajic because the commander ordered you to. You're probably out of the Army. Mm-hmm. You're not going to make it.
What's the cost to the military when somebody commits suicide? I mean, there's a life insurance policy.
Yeah, so they will tell you that if you commit suicide or if you get in a motorcycle accident without your helmet on, or you do any of these kinds of things that are sort of your fault, that your family is not going to get the insurance. It's bullshit. They get it every time. They try to scare you into like not doing stuff like that, but they get it every time.
What is the amount of the payout?
It's $400,000, and then there's $100,000 death gratuity, so it's $500,000. So they
get $500,000 when a guy. Well.
And this has got to figure into it because one of the things you were talking about with that 3-stage model, and I don't remember who the person was, but you talked about one of those 3 phases being sense of burdenness, and this is a motivation for a lot of older men: is that I'm worth more dead than I am alive, and I'm wondering if that factors in as well with some of these guys.
Do girlfriends and fiancés receive that benefit, or is it only wives?
Well, technically, it's whoever you put on the beneficiary form. But if you've left it blank, it's going to be your wife because wife is next of kin.
So you have a girlfriend
not a
on deployment.
Unless you indicate that.
She's staying in your accommodation. You're not married, but she's a beneficiary. She's got the benefits. She's got the medical benefits, the dental benefits, all that stuff.
Right.
I'm not entirely surprised that they write some letters like that are that fucking harsh.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty weird. It's I don't know. It's not like we said. It's not a situation that I would
I'm just trying to get my head around the motivation. Like, why would this woman send a Dear John letter to a guy doing the right thing in such a crass way? Like, what's the benefit? I mean, is $500,000 like, is that what she's looking for?
I honestly don't think that women who send Dear John letters like that are trying to instigate their husbands into suicide. I don't think they're that far forward thing.
They're not that crazy.
Yeah, well, I just don't get that sense. It's maybe a handful of
tattoos and 57 piercings, right? So she's not crazy at all.
Well, it's not so much a matter of crazy. It's just a matter of I think a woman who's going to write a letter like that is probably pretty like low on like forward thinking concepts and frontal lobe development, and like, you know, able to like track the second and third order effects of what she's done. Like, I don't think that.
Yeah, you guys are
any of
using
that stuff
doctor
is on
terms.
her.
I'm just going to call her a frigid bitch. Man, this is an eye opener. This one, fellas. We got 5 minutes left. Do you guys want to cover anything else before we wrap up, or any final words?
So divorce in the military gets kind of complicated, right?
Right.
In 5 minutes, can you tell us how?
Kind of the light way to put it.
So like I said, you know, the military has married and not married, right? So then there's a whole bunch of other parts about it that make it complicated. One of them is, if you have been married to the soldier for 10 years and a day, let's say you got married to him on day one of his Army career, and you made it to the 10th year and then divorce, and then he retires 30 years later, you get a portion of that retirement just because you were married to him for that 10-year period way back at the beginning of his career. Like, there's a lot of those kinds of incentives.
Federal law. That's not based
and I hear
on
horror
state,
stories
like it's
about.
on
Oh, okay, yeah.
I hear horror stories about guys getting divorced in the military and not knowing the rules, and, you know, just giving up half of their pension or whatever, when they don't have to give up that much. They have to give up a proportionate amount, and it sort of depends on the state that you're initiating divorce in and so forth. But if you're getting divorced in the military, I guess you better talk to at least a few lawyers and figure out how it all works.
Oh yeah, and there's all around military bases, there's billboards, military divorce, $500. I mean, it's such a common thing that, you know,
ads everywhere for
there's a whole, like.
Do you know who Terrence Popp is, Scott?
No.
He's got a YouTube channel. He's a ex-military guy, but he cracks a lot of joke. Like, he's a red pill kind of guy, maybe MGTOW if you want to call it that way. I did you might want to look it up because it's an interesting talk, because he had a different experience than I did. But Aaron Cleary hosted. I know
who he is. I've by your description, I recognize.
Yeah. So Aaron Cleary hosted both me and Terrence on a conversation about divorce, and I mean, his wife killed his dog. There's all kinds of shit that happened through the course of the divorce and all that. But Drape 2 Man, I'm trying to pronounce your super chat correctly, but thanks for the super chat. He said Terrence Popp talked about these issues from his divorce. His story was frightening that the military threw him under the bus. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of getting a feel for that tonight right now on this one. All right, let's go through the wrap up on this. I got to quickly shout out to channel sponsorships. So let me just go solo layout here. And I'll throw the banner up there so you guys can see. But we have the Tactical Soap guys over at Grondike Soap and Beard Oil, Pheromone Infused. You're showering anyway, might as well grab the stuff that supports the creation of content like this on the channel. You can go right to coopersoap.com. The coupon code's already applied. Or after I get off the broadcast, I'll link it in the top comment. So appreciate any support you guys hop on for that. And I'm going to do a live Q&A after this in about 15 minutes, again, on the YouTube channel. So if you have questions, if you're a member of the channel or in the private community, there's already links posted. You guys can hop in. You guys can ask questions first.
Are we staying for that?
No, I was just going to do it myself. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's it, guys. I want to thank you for hopping on and joining us, Scott. That was different. I was expecting a little bit of something else. But you blew my beliefs away with that a little bit. I wasn't expecting it all to be about suicide, which is pretty fucking dramatic, man. Like that's crazy.
Yeah, it's not a fun topic, but I'm pretty good at it. So
yeah. Well, guys, if you're watching this and you get that Dear John letter, or you find out something's going on back home that's a little funky Cole Medina, you don't need a permanent solution to a temporary problem, right? And there are answers out there. It's really just a matter of unplugging from comforting lies and subscribing to some uncomfortable truths that will update your beliefs. And hopefully you can get past that shit show that is, heartbreak and all the stuff that kind of ties into it when you get lied to about the way things are and they're really not that way. So, Scott, they can find you at Treasure State Psychologist. Let me just go full screen so I can pull your screen up there again. Treasure State Psychological Services. The link was in the chat. You can also find Sean Smith on Twitter at Iron Shrink. And if you haven't got his book, Tactical Guide to Women, it is a great read. Make sure you grab it. He'll show you how to look for problem women so you don't make a train wreck out of your life. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks for the next show, which will be on March 16th. Do we have a topic for that one, Sean?
I think we do, but I don't remember. I don't know if we've ironed out all the details. So,
all right. So follow us on social media. We always create the event a few days beforehand, but we'll be on again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, gentlemen.
Scott, thanks so much, man.
All right. I had fun.